Labor says the United States is not Australia's closest ally. These shock comments the very same week as China's foreign minister meets with Penny Wong. Joe Hildebrand and Liz Storer will be on the show to discuss. And Labor continues to deflect the blame over its self-made immigration detention mess. This as Parliament resumed today. Plus, the new Australian report that points to a lab origin of COVID-19. The scientist who led that research will join me live a bit later. But first, to that exclusive tonight, I can reveal that the Albanese government has removed the head of ASIO and ASIS from its National Security Committee of Cabinet in a move that reflects the diminishing role of the intelligence chiefs under Labor. My sources tell me that the intelligence community is growing increasingly concerned about the approach taken by the Albanese government on national security. Under the coalition, the head of ASIO and ASIS were permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. This is the body that makes decisions on the highest risk and most urgent national security matters. The intelligence chiefs gave classified advice on issues that affect our security and our sovereignty. But I can reveal that the nation's most senior bureaucrat, Glyn Davis, under the Albanese government, has removed them as permanent members. Instead, they're now invited in on a case-by-case basis. Asked why ASIO and ASIS had been removed from the National Security Committee of Cabinet, an Albanese government spokesperson told me today, "We don't comment on matters relating to national security." We asked ASIO the same questions and their spokesperson said membership of cabinet committees is a matter for government. Glyn Davis hasn't responded to our questions, but Shadow Minister for Home Affairs James Paterson says this is a reckless decision. He said it is very concerning to hear that the Albanese government has removed intelligence and security agency heads from the critical committee of government considering national security matters. He says they should have available the best advice from our expert agencies when making decisions in the national interest. He says that's pretty hard if they're not in the room. He says no wonder this government has been so weak and incompetent on national security, and he's calling for them to reverse this reckless decision urgently. And as I said, Andrew Hastie will be on the show for some live reaction in a moment. But Glyn Davis is the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He's no doubt a distinguished public servant and professor. But his move in removing the intelligence chiefs, along with his review of funding for think tanks, have been met with dismay and alarm in national security circles. When Glyn Davis was the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne in 2014, he re-signed an agreement to partner with the Confucius Institute. He reportedly wrote in a letter that he was very happy to confirm that the University of Melbourne will continue the collaboration on the development of the Confucius Institute and extend the agreement. Now, at the time, there was already growing concern around the role of the Beijing-sponsored Confucius Institutes in impeding on free speech and being a vehicle for foreign influence. Glyn Davis was also on the Beijing trip when Daniel Andrews committed to the Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative in 2015. As you'll recall, the former coalition government tore up Andrews' controversial BRI agreement on national security grounds. And you can see Glyn Davis pictured here in the centre of that delegation, right next to Daniel Andrews at Beijing's Temple of Heaven. Davis also accompanied Anthony Albanese when he met with Xi Jinping in late 2022. It was the first time an Australian Prime Minister had met the Chinese president in 6 years. And Glyn Davis has visited China on numerous other occasions to sign cooperation agreements between universities where he was working. Now, you compare this to politicians working in the national security space like James Paterson and Andrew Hastie, who've been denied visas to even visit China. Now, also under Anthony Albanese and Glyn Davis, A review announced just last month into whether to cut funding to think tanks, including ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which receives funding from both Australia and the United States. Shutting down ASPI was on China's list of 14 demands that was issued under the coalition government. Well, who did Glyn Davis appoint to lead this review of think tanks? Well, none other but Peter Varghese, who's the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, where he famously came up against Drew Pavlou, who was the student suspended from the university for his activism against China. In an appearance at Senate estimates, Varghese said the University of Queensland couldn't have improved its response to Drew Pavlou, who he also accused of running conspiracy theories.
I don't know why Mr. Pavlou continues to hold to his conspiracy theory. I think one of the difficulties, frankly, that the university faced was that it was bound to a level of confidentiality in what it could say about the substance of the case at a time when one of the parties to the process didn't feel so bound. And that meant that our ability to deal with this in the media in particular was somewhat constrained.
Other than being able to publicly comment on it, the university doesn't feel that it mishandled this matter in any way.
My view is that it was handled in accordance with established processes.
Now, you would think it seems highly unusual to have the chair of one think tank judging the funding of others. And yet Peter Varghese is the chair of a rival think tank, AsiaLink, which is linked to the Melbourne University. And yet he's leading the review of whether to cut funding to other think tanks, including ASPI, which is unashamedly pro the United States and is often critical of China and foreign interference. But aside from removing the intelligence chiefs from the government's premier national security decision-making body and reviewing funding for a think tank that irritates Beijing, the broader picture here is that the Albanese government has stopped publicly criticising China. Labor figure Cameron Milner, who's going to be on with me in just a minute, he describes the silence as a clear capitulation to China from the Albanese government that he says is deeply worrying. And Penny Wong hasn't mentioned Chinese human rights abuses in Xinjiang in the past 18 months. I've asked her office if we've missed any public comments. They didn't even respond. Yet Penny Wong criticises Israel virtually daily for defending its citizens from a major terrorist attack. And just on Friday, she outrageously reinstated funding to a United Nations organisation where employees took part in the October 7 attacks. She didn't even bother to wait for the formal review into the organisation. Now, the ASIO boss, Mike Burgess, is the only official still daring to speak publicly about Chinese foreign interference, espionage and infiltration. He says it is our #1 security threat. But now his voice is no longer a permanent fixture in the National Security Committee of Cabinet. His removal at a time when we're facing our most challenging set of circumstances since World War II. Russia's war in Ukraine, Israel's fight against terror, Chinese aggression in our region, and the axis of evil with Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea forming a closer alliance. At this time, we need our strongest possible national security approach to protect our sovereignty and to stop the disintegration of social cohesion. But instead, we have a weak, left-wing, watered-down national security approach, thanks to the foreign policy duds now running the show, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. All right, let's bring in our Political Insiders panel to respond to this. I've got former Chief of Staff to Bill Shorten and current Director of GXO Strategies, Cameron Milner, also the former Press Secretary to Scott Morrison, and now Director at Headline Advisory, Andrew Carswell. Cameron, Andrew, welcome to you both. Cameron, first to you. What's your response to this story? To the revelations that the security chiefs are no longer permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. They have to be invited in on a case-by-case basis. Also, to the role of Glyn Davis and to the Albanese government's approach to China.
Well, what an extraordinary exclusive. And thank goodness you've brought up this news for us and our viewers, because this is an incredible development in terms of our national security. In the week that Wang Yi is coming to meet Paul Keating in Sydney and a couple of other Australian officials, you've got Glyn Davis, who is obviously a Beijing buddy, who's worked with China. He's been an apologist for China on campus in his time as professor, still staying on the National Security Committee, overseeing reviews of key strategic agencies like ASPI. So Glyn Davis, who's a mate of China, who's been there on multiple times, he stays on the committee, but our actual professional heads of intelligence, who you would think would have to be in every single meeting, they're there by invitation from Glyn. It's appalling. Glyn has lots of questions to answer. I'm glad your program started those questions, but Glyn has to come out from the shadows and explain just how close he is to Beijing, because I think he's incredibly close.
Andrew Carswell, and just on that point, I did put questions to Glyn Davis today, as I mentioned, about his past ties with China in his role as university professor. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but it is different from the national security approach that we've seen in more recent years under the coalition government. Andrew Carswell, what do you think about all of this?
Well, it says to me, Sharri, that even in the most important room, arguably in the country, certainly in Parliament House, that personality, politics and ideology sit above issues of national security when it comes to the hierarchy. I mean, this is galling, and this says that the political geniuses in National Security Committee of Cabinet think they know more about issues of intelligence and national security than chiefs that have been in the game for decades. It says a lot about the political personnel in that room, more so than the intelligence personnel. But it also says it's either two things here. It's either they stopped listening to the intelligence chiefs a long time ago, and now they're just getting rid of them, save them from the embarrassment of having to appear and not say anything, or that this is just a pushback against the public rhetoric that we're hearing more and more from our intelligence chiefs, because they feel like they're not being listened to. They've been railing against Chinese aggression for a very long time, and they've suddenly run headlong into a government that does not want to hear one bit of it. I mean, how galling is it, the fact that the very guy that could save the nation from an imminent attack is booted out? The guy that could save the economy from being inundated with cyber aggression is booted out. We don't want to hear from him anymore. It says a lot about the fact that Anthony Albanese sees this role as he's the genius here. Penny Wong and him are the geniuses here. They know more about this. But when you take intelligence out of the room, all you're left with is ideology.
I think that Mike Burgess's most recent address to the nation, where he outlined that our top threat, unquestionably, he said, was foreign interference, and then he later confirmed in interviews that that was China. He also said the top terror threat was Islamic extremism. And both of these areas, you never hear the government speak about. You don't hear Albanese speaking about Islamic extremism, Penny Wong either. You don't hear them speaking about Chinese foreign interference. They've prioritise getting the relationship back on track rather than calling out Chinese aggression, despite the fact that they have the motto that you need to agree where you can and disagree where you must. There isn't any disagreeing going on, despite that being their motto. And then you had this today in the Senate. Trade Minister Don Farrell, he was standing in for Penny Wong, and he was asked a question about why the government resumed funding to UNRWA, despite its links to terrorism. Listen to what he had to say.
Minister, why is the Albanese Labor government acting in opposition to the United States, our most trusted international partner, who await the outcomes of the investigation into UNRWA and in the interim is pursuing alternate means of delivering more humanitarian assistance?
Well, I take issue with your original or your first statement there. I'm not sure that the United States is our most trusted ally. I would have said New Zealand.
Cameron Milner, United States, not our most trusted ally? I mean, the timing of these comments, the same week as Wang Yi arrives in Australia, can't be a coincidence.
And Don was obviously channeling his inner Penny Wong thoughts in that remark. But I find it appalling. I live in Brisbane. We were the Brisbane line during the Second World War. General MacArthur based himself in Brisbane. The 7th Fleet was created in Brisbane, the US 7th Fleet. If not for the US, we would not have been able to defend against Japan and the hyper-aggression at that time from Japan. So the World War II was won because of American assistance and Australian grit and hard work. It's appalling. It's appalling that we'd forget that history so quickly and dismiss the importance of AUKUS to defending our nation yet again in terms of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and elsewhere.
I mean, Andrew, we rely, as Cameron just indicated, we rely on the United States to protect us. You know, God forbid we should ever need protection in our region. New Zealand's not going to come to our aid. New Zealand's not going to have the military equipment to defend us. And by the way, New Zealand doesn't even have the same approach to us on China or national security.
Yeah, look, it's just embarrassing. I mean, this is not just a Labor backbencher. This is the Trade Minister. And these are statements that you would expect to come from a Green senator or a crossbencher that is on the fringe. It is not something that should be uttered by a Trade Minister. And look, it's Don Farrell. I mean, it's like Mum and Dad were away and, you know, just let the crazy uncle up to the microphone to give his spray. That's what we've come to expect here. You see the smirk on his face. He was, sidestepping a very important question asked about funding to Gaza, and he thought he could just tiptoe around it, but instead he just fell over his own feet. It's embarrassing. Yeah,
and I'm going to come back to the UNRWA question a bit later in the show. And Don Farrell, by the way, is from the right faction of the Labor Party. He's not even from the left, so it was very unusual to hear that coming out of his mouth as well. Also in question time today, now embattled Immigration Minister Andrew Giles refused to directly answer if any more criminals would be released from immigration detention centres. Here's how that went down.
Over the next 6 months, how many foreign criminals will finish a custodial sentence and be released into the community instead of going to immigration detention?
I thank the Shadow Minister for his question, and I remind him and remind the House that what we are talking about here arises from a decision of the High Court. A decision, indeed, that we argued strongly against, but one that any government, like any government, we must oblige to follow the law and comply with the orders of the court.
Look, Cameron, this question of detainees, what the government's going to do about it, again dominated question time. At some point, do you think they're going to have to move on Andrew Giles? Because he does seem to be the weak link.
Well, Giles is loyal to Albanese and Albanese is loyal to Giles, however grossly incompetent this guy is. Blaming the High Court, for goodness sake, he's the minister responsible. And for it to be easier for an assassin and a pedophile and a slave trader to get a visa than someone fleeing Hamas is appalling. And that's what Giles is doing on his watch.
What do you think about this debate, Andrew?
If it wasn't so serious, it'd be hilarious. I mean, we're moving from one bungle to the next now. And it's like the Immigration Minister tried to give the right to disconnect laws a bit of a trial run over summer, and he just abrogated responsibility from his duties. He just switched off. And now we're seeing a government that is no longer just sitting on their hands on this issue. They're putting their hands up in the air and going, how do we fix this? They've run out of ideas. I mean, when they called the media together on Friday to discuss this new situation with the High Court, it was effectively saying that we have lost control of the borders and we have lost control of our immigration detention centre. That is how serious it gets. This keeps going until the head rolls. And the way you get through a crisis is you get through it as quick as you can. And the only way they get through this crisis is by calling for the head of the Immigration Minister himself.
Or by actually fixing the problem if they are capable of doing that.
That's true.
Now, there was this really insignificant interview that you might have all read in the Weekend Australian. Former union heavyweight and former Labor MP Jenny George criticised the current Labor Party for prioritising its renewable energy policy over working people. Look, she's a Labor legend. She says the Labor Party now isn't the party she first joined and loved. She says it's lost its moral compass. And she says she's watched in despair as new energy warriors betray her old Labor values. She told the journalist Christine Middup that, of course, I am always Labor at heart. I feel like I'm old Labor. I feel like the party left me. I didn't leave it. Now, I have to say, I've got the highest admiration for Jenny George. Our paths first crossed when I was a political journalist, and we've maintained our contact since my Canberra days. I think she's very brave for coming out publicly to speak about how Labor has lost its way. Cameron, you probably agree with her. You're also fighting for Labor to return to the party that it was under other more centrist leaders.
Well, and Labor's best when it's moderate and centre-right, not, the cabals for the left or pulled off on other sort of strange issues and down tangents. So Labor, at a working class, trade union-based party, is most successful. And I think Jenny's comments are great. I think it's great that someone like Jenny's spoken out passionately about where she sees the Labor Party going and the track it needs to get back on to actually better connect to its voters and its base.
Yeah, and I read the comments under that story, and most of the Australian readers agreed with her, so she has a lot of support there. Cameron Milner, Andrew Carswell, thank you both so much for joining me tonight. Now, after the break, I'm going to speak with Andrew Hastie about Penny Wong's decision to resume funding to the UN body where employees actually took part in the terror attacks. Also, a new scientific paper points to the lab origin of COVID-19. The scientist behind it will join me live, so stay tuned for all of that. Welcome back. Well, Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese on Friday announced the unsurprising but outrageous decision to resume funding to UNRWA. That's a UN agency where employees took part in the October 7 terror attacks and where thousands of members have expressed support for Hamas. Penny Wong didn't even bother to wait for the outcome of the independent review, which is being conducted by a former French minister into the organisation. Now, it's possible the review could recommend scrutiny and some reform, but you have to ask, why is she so desperate to reinstate the $6 million of your taxpayer funds that she can't just wait a few more days until we know the outcome of the review? According to Australian law, it's a criminal offence to fund an organisation that's associated directly or indirectly with terrorism. And Hamas is a listed terror organisation in Australia. Now, I understand this decision was made during a National Security Committee of Cabinet meeting late last week. We've already heard that Don Farrell deflected questions over it today in question time, and Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie joins me now. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Look, do you think it's possible that Labor has broken Australian law by reinstating funding to an organisation that we know is linked to terror?
That's a question for lawyers to answer, Sharri, but it does not pass the pub test at all. As you said yourself just a moment ago, Hamas is a listed terrorist organisation in Australia, and there is still an independent review into connections with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency and Hamas, and there is no way that we should have reinstated that money to UNRWA before that independent review was complete. I think it's unacceptable. No money at all from Australian taxpayers should go towards organisations that have even a shadow of doubt over their credibility and integrity. And at the moment, UNRWA has questions to answer.
And there are other vehicles for giving aid to innocent Palestinians who are suffering. The United States is doing it from a barge offshore. There's also the Red Cross and other agencies that haven't been linked to terrorism.
There are many other options, and so you do have to ask the question, why is the government doing this? Why couldn't they be patient and wait? And I think it just shows that this government has terrible instincts on foreign and defence policy. I think it has bad strategic instincts, but also bad moral instincts. I think they should have waited, and until these questions are answered, not a single bit of Australian money should go towards that organisation.
Well, Andrew, I've also reported tonight that the Albanese government and Glyn Davis has removed the head of ASIO and ASIS from its National Security Committee of Cabinet as permanent members. Instead, they're invited in on a case-by-case basis. Do you think this is a good idea?
Again, it's a very concerning data point. It's a warning sign flashing red for me. When you're kicking the intelligence heads out of the committee that is responsible for national security and government, that's a big, big warning sign that this government is lost. And I think it's very concerning. Intelligence heads, it's not their jobs to deliver good news. They deliver bad news, and their job is to warn the government of challenges ahead. So to not have the head of ASIS and the head of ASIO in the room is very concerning. It's a reckless decision.
James Paterson also used that word, reckless. He gave me a comment earlier in the evening. Paul Keating has been invited to an unofficial meeting with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi this week, and it does look like he has agreed to that meeting now. Paul Keating, who has a very different view on Australia's national security approach to the bipartisan position, if there is one anymore, but certainly even to the Labor government, even though it has gone softer. I mean, Paul Keating's quite pro-China. Is this meeting appropriate?
Well, Paul Keating has form. He's attacked AUKUS multiple times over the last 2 years. And I think that this meeting is Paul Keating lifting his leg over the Albanese government. I think it's very poor form from him. And I think it undermines the Albanese government. And as a former Labor Prime Minister, he should know better. If you're going to run down AUKUS, well, then you could be free to do that. But if you're going to meet up with the Chinese Foreign Minister, I think it sends a really bad signal. And it's at cross purposes with what this government's trying to achieve. Of course, we welcome dialogue with China, and we hope to see the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister raise HMAS Toowoomba and its divers in the incident last year. We hope that they can remove the wine tariffs and also raise Dr. Yang Hengjun's appalling treatment by the Chinese government. And so for Paul Keating potentially to undermine that, I think it's appalling.
Yeah, it was an interesting turn of phrase there about Paul Keating raising the leg on the Albanese government. Now, very sad event today that you attended, family and friends paying tribute to Lance Corporal Jack Fitzgibbon at his funeral service. The 33-year-old died during an ADF parachute training exercise. He's the son of former Labor Minister Joel Fitzgibbon. There were, I think, over 1,000 people there paying their respect. Devastating day. Andrew, you were there. What was the service like?
It was a very moving service, and Joel Fitzgibbon is a friend. To see his wife Diane and his daughters in their grief, their extended family and friends, it was very hard to watch, but it was a funeral that honoured the life of Lance Corporal Jack Fitzgibbon. It honoured his service, and there was a real warmth in the building today as we mourned his passing and farewelled him, and I think it was very appropriate. His commanding officer from the 2nd Commando Regiment gave a great speech, and the family's eulogies were very, very touching. So it was great to see the Prime Minister there, Peter Dutton there, and a number of other MPs from both sides. So it was an honour to be there.
It's very, very tragic, a young life lost. Andrew Hastie, thank you very much for joining me tonight. Now, a change of pace now. A new scientific paper by the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales adds to the growing global body of evidence that COVID-19 leaked from a laboratory, most likely the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In this report, the UNSW global biosecurity expert Raina McIntyre says that a lab leak is equally or more probable than a natural origin, although both are possible. And she joins me now. Raina, thank you very much for your time. Tell me about your new research 4 years after the outbreak.
So, Sharri, we applied a known tool that's used most commonly in military contexts. So it's called the Gruno-Fink tool, and it's a risk analysis tool that looks at 11 different criteria and scores them, and then looks at the sum of the scores to come up with a likelihood of whether or not whether the outbreak's natural or unnatural. So there's a threshold value, and if the score comes out below that, it's more likely to be natural, and if it comes up above that, it's more likely to be unnatural. It doesn't give a definitive answer, and the scores can change depending on who scores them, but they shouldn't change a huge amount. But ultimately, the bottom line is the likelihood of an unnatural outbreak is non-trivial, which means that you can't really dismiss it as a fringe conspiracy theory.
Yeah, you absolutely can't. Look, we've seen a lot of scientific analysis pointing to a lab leak origin, but then there's also the intelligence and government sources who are telling us information about the origin of COVID. For example, the fact that among the first cluster of the pandemic are believed to be researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Does all of this, the intelligence, the government sources, paint a more complete picture?
Yes, it does. And, I think that's one of the reasons we use this tool, that you need to consider more than just the virology, because the phylogenetics or the genetic signature of the virus may not necessarily tell you about whether it's been engineered, because some methods that are used for gain-of-function research can result in a virus that looks quite natural. So you do need to look at other lines of evidence, such as the epidemiology, intelligence, looking for particular geopolitical issues and other relevant information, as you did in your book, Sharri, which really collected a lot of evidence very early on that kind of looked at that broad spectrum of different intelligence.
Thank you, Raina. Look, you also mentioned gain-of-function research just then, and just to remind viewers, this is research where a virus can gain new functions. It can have the ability to become airborne, for example, where it wasn't before. And this type of research is considered so risky that the Obama administration banned it. The ban was then lifted by Anthony Fauci. But in any case, this type of research had been outsourced to China, in part funded by America. Can you tell me some information about what you think the general risks of this research, gain-of-function research, is, and whether you think that now we still need better global regulation in biosafety?
Yeah, so there are particular types of gain-of-function research that apply to what we call enhanced pandemic potential pathogens. So that doesn't, that wouldn't include most of the research that goes on in virology. It's a very small subset of that research that is that may potentially cause a pandemic if it escaped from a lab. And the technology is actually becoming more and more accessible. It's becoming cheaper. For example, in 2018, a paper was published showing how to synthesize from scratch a virus very similar to smallpox. That's called synthetic biology, which is different from genetic engineering, which is the gain-of-function research. So the technology has really exploded, and the accessibility and the cost has made it much more prevalent and difficult to manage the risk. But in fact, the United States, who have a committee called the National Science Advisory Board on Biodefense, have started making moves to improve the regulation of the specific subset of virus research on enhanced pandemic potential pathogens.
All right, Professor Raina McIntyre, thank you so much for your time. And we've all seen those emails of when Anthony Fauci in January 2020 was madly emailing everyone to try and find out whether his agency had in fact funded the gain-of-function research in Wuhan. So, you have these committees in place, but oftentimes people don't follow it. Now, coming up after the break, Liz Storer and Joe Hildebrand will join me to speak about climate zealots. Can't they just leave our streets in peace? Plus, from Australia to Ireland, how the progressive left keep losing the referendum wars. I'll be back after this quick break. Okay, welcome back. Well, for our regular Monday panel, let's bring in now Liz Storer, Sky News host and contributor Jo Hildebrand. Welcome to you both.
Hello. Lovely to be here.
Now, let's start by talking about these climate zealots. Over 30 were arrested on Saturday in Melbourne CBD. They were once again putting on a show by blocking tram tracks and stopping everyone from just going about their daily business. Last week's climate protests left one woman who was caught in the traffic on her way to the hospital. She had no choice but to actually give birth in her car. Jo, this is really... someone's going to lose their life because people are blocking traffic. Protest, but don't put everyone else out.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's insane. I mean, leaving aside the dangerousness of it and putting other people's lives in jeopardy, which tells you everything you need to know about how much these people really care about others. It is the most counterproductive, self-imploding strategy you can pursue if you actually genuinely do believe in climate change. Clearly, these people are either some kind of weird brain damaged sociopaths, or they simply, and maybe it's both, or they simply care more about their own virtue signalling than they do about actually getting results. Now, I say this as someone who has, run campaigns for climate change. I did, of course, the Mission Zero campaign for News Corp that ended up, I think, paving the way for the coalition government to actually set a target of net zero by 2050. So actual, real, tangible change, and those targets have since been strengthened by Labor. That is how you get things done. And we did that, of course, by saying, look, these are the opportunities in the economy that could be presented. We are not going to leave any worker behind. We're going to make sure that, that it's not more expensive for households, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Not all of those things worked out the way we'd hope, but again, this is how you get change by talking to Middle Australia and offering them benefits, not by ruining their day. And of course, every single person who's delayed, every single person who's had their day ruined by these numbskulls is going to end up thinking that whatever cause it is they're espousing must be as vapid and selfish and stupid and irrational as they are.
And yet the government is doing similar, right? They keep foisting these unreasonable, ridiculous measures on everyday Australians, whether it's, you can't turn your aircon up as high as you want it to be, or as low in this case. If you're in Queensland, we're going to control it. You have to buy an EV. We're phasing out diesel cars. Now we're making it more expensive for you to buy a car with grunt, etc., and so on. And I think that is why every single time, Sharri, these guys, even if they're arrested for massively inconveniencing the masses, just lawfully trying to go about their business, they only ever get a slap on the wrist. I mean, we saw last week in Melbourne, the police had to move them on. They were lying on the ground pretending to be dead. I mean, this is nonsense. And yet the judiciary does not ever seem to give these people stiff enough consequences for their actions because, as I always argue, they are in a way doing the government's bidding, keeping this in the consciousness of the community to say, climate change and it's so urgent, because with a government that is pushing these ridiculous policies, and you mentioned targets, Jo, but this government itself has admitted they're never going to reach any of them in time. These guys make it look ridiculous.
It's like the Greta Thunberg, how dare you? Like, it just makes it a farce. And so, and same with all the catastrophic predictions, and same, of course, and you're absolutely right, in punishing, you can't punish people into agreeing with you. You can't say, we're going to take away all these things that you rely on or that make your life a bit more comfortable, or that you enjoy, like cooking with gas, or, being able to have a nice temperature.
How is the government any better? Even having your rubbish collected once a week, not a luxury.
You don't have to. There are plenty of smart people out there. There are plenty of amazing things that could be possible, maybe with the help of nuclear, who knows. But whatever. This does not have to be living with net zero doesn't have to be a life of misery. In fact, it can be a life that's much, much better. But with these sort of catastrophists, it just ruins that, and it actually hurts the government. It doesn't help it.
All right, let's have a look at another topic. Just as Australia's push for a voice referendum failed, there was a similar push to change Ireland's referendum that has also crashed. A couple of weekends ago, Irish voters overwhelmingly rejected a referendum to rewrite their constitution. It was a defiant pushback against the ruling progressive elites. The Irish were asked if they wanted to change the definition of the word family and to update the role of women's duties at home. 68% and 74% said no, respectively. Liz, it seems like there is this push that's happening globally, and yet again another resounding rejection.
Well, it just goes to show here's another Western government completely out of touch with the vast majority of people that they're supposed to be representing. It's a good reminder. Ireland is still a very Catholic country, a very conservative country, and the elites in Dublin clearly have absolutely no clue the people that they're supposed to be representing. I absolutely loved this referendum. It's another reminder. These governments that are obsessed with social manipulation, this kind of social conditioning, what these people were doing was standing up for their way of life. These were two referendums, one on motherhood and the other on marriage. That's effectively what they were. And these guys weren't having a bar of it. I love the story coming out saying in some of these polling booths, there were these religious medallions that some probably...
Miracle medals.
That's what they're called, the Virgin Mary. And it's a symbol of her crushing a serpent underneath her feet, which I think is very apt to represent most Western governments these days, trying to foist this progressive agenda on us, trying to make us feel like, oh, you're so backwards and you're so, well, you're just not modern enough unless you're on board with our agenda. And such a comprehensive vote in both referendums, it just sends them packing. It's a beautiful thing. I love it.
Let's have a quick look at what Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said overnight. He's refusing to succumb to international pressure. He says he is going to press on with destroying Hamas in Gaza. Have a look.
We cannot have a future for Gaza, a future for peace, a future for Israel, if Hamas, a terrorist organization committed to our genocide, remains intact. If it remains intact, it will regroup and reconquer the Gaza Strip and, as they vowed, repeat the massacre again and again and again.
And this comes after, look, this happened Friday night, overnight our time, kind of early Saturday morning, but the US Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Joe, he came out and said Israel needs to hold elections. They have to get rid of Netanyahu. I mean, you know, everyone has their own view on Netanyahu, but ultimately, who the hell is America to tell Israel when to hold elections? It's a democracy. Why isn't America telling Gaza to hold elections and to get rid of Hamas?
That's right. Well, I think Hamas got up in the last election, and that was, what, 2006? It's a really hard one. I think this is, I mean, obviously to hold an election in the middle of this would be pretty messy, and I don't think you can really do that. We know the point of holding the election would be to change the sort of the strategy behind the tactics that Israel is currently using. But I think there is a genuine concern about just how far Netanyahu and it's not just Netanyahu who's at issue here, but the fact that to hold government, he needs to cozy up to people who are far to the right of him. So he's actually doing the bidding of people who are.
But that's not even happening now. Like there seems to be
they do have a war. Yeah, they've got a war cabinet.
Hamas.
That's right. So as soon as that happened, they brought in a war cabinet that had people from all parties. But that seems to be splintering a bit. And even as long ago as I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal that said that the IDF itself and the head of the IDF and the defence minister are now saying we do not actually have a purpose for this war anymore. Yes, we all agree that Hamas has to be wiped out, and Netanyahu is absolutely correct about that. But what happens then? So we're fighting this massive war.
Well, it's returning the hostages and destroying Hamas.
But what takes Hamas's place? What are they trying to? You know, it's regime change. So it's regime change replaced with what? So it looks like.
Change. But the US saying this, they're obviously just shilling for votes. They've got an election coming up, and they know that they're going to bleed votes over their support of Israel. I say support of Israel because the democratic support of Israel is about as baseless as the support they get from our government here. Left is like left. So they want to be seen as saying this. And Netanyahu is quite right in saying this is completely inappropriate. But what they're playing on is a legitimate lack of popularity for Netanyahu. We saw this way before the massacres on October 7th. Hundreds of thousands of people marched asking him to resign. This weekend, the footage of the rally on Saturday night absolutely massive, demanding that he resign. So that's what the US is playing on. But for them, it's really just about votes.
About politics. And I wouldn't be surprised if Biden got Chuck Schumer as a Jew to go out there and say that for him.
100%.
Liz Storer, Joe Hildebrand, thank you both so much.
Cheers.
Now, after the break, Chris Merritt will join me to discuss the mess over the detainee debacle and the top prosecutor in New South Wales under serious pressure. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, joining me now is the Rule of Law Institute of Australia's Chris Merritt. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Look, the Herald is reporting that the Albanese government wants to try run another case in the High Court. You've written a column where you say, in effect, it's completely inappropriate for the government to continue to blame the High Court for failures that are of their own making. Can you expand on this?
Yes. All this flows from a landmark case late last year, NZYQ, which made a very simple ruling, really. It was that the issuing of punishments to people, regardless of whether they're Australian citizens or unlawful arrivals in this country, can only be done by the judiciary, cannot be done by Parliament. That, when you apply that more broadly, it changes the nature of migration detention. What we're seeing, the story that's on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, raises this question really clearly. It concerns an Iranian detainee who's refused to cooperate with authorities who want to deport him to Iran. He doesn't want to go back to Iran, so what he's doing is by refusing to cooperate, he's stymied the government's ability to deport him in the reasonable near future. And that breaches the rule set down by the High Court. If you can't deport these people, you can't keep them indefinitely. Now, I don't think the High Court will accept this ploy. They'll see through it. I think they'll see that this technique can't fly. Now, that doesn't mean to say that other tactics, other matters will possibly be vulnerable. And what I'm talking about here is the use of ankle bracelets, the use of curfews on detainees who are set free. There's an argument, a reasonably respectable argument in academic circles, that these look a lot like punitive measures. They don't look as though they're measures designed to protect the general community. And unless the court finds that these are protective measures, I don't think they'll fly.
But this is what I want to ask you about, Chris. So, you know, sometimes if a criminal has done something, you do need to keep them behind bars to protect community safety. So do you think the High Court has actually, in the case of hardened criminals, got it wrong in this decision? I mean, it's a question we don't often talk about. Do you think they did get it wrong in this case?
No, I don't. I think, there is a case for protecting the community from hardened criminals. But who should do that? Should it be up to a politician to simply determine that Fred is a hardened criminal and therefore should be subject to continuing detention or should be subject to ankle bracelets and curfews? Those look a lot like punishments. And the court hasn't said you can't do those things. What it said is that if you want those things done to protect the community, the safest way to do it, because they do look a lot like punishments, is to get judicial sign-off. The judiciary is responsible for punishments, not the Parliament, not the executive. This is fundamental to the separation of powers. This entire issue has been caught up in very intense politics, but at its core is the restriction on the power of politicians to lock people up without a court signing off on it.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's going to continue to be a big issue in Parliament this week, as it was today. Chris Merritt, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you, everyone, for your company this evening. I'll see you tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. And right now, here's Paul Murray.